he had security throw his wife out of the gala. Then he learned she owned everything. The glistening glass arches of the Grand Guildhall in Mayfair, London, shimmered under the rain on the most anticipated evening of the green technology sector. Inside, hundreds of international dignitaries, global investors, and press correspondents gathered for the inaugural gala of Vanguard Green Tech, celebrating its multi-billion-pound public listing and global expansion. Eleanor Vance sat in the back of her electric sedan, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. Clutched tightly in her hands was a navy velvet box containing a restored 19th-century nautical brass compass, intricately engraved on the brass casing with the date October 14, 1998, the day she and her husband, Julian Vance, had sketched their very first tidal turbine prototype in a cramped, drafty garage in Edinburgh. When Eleanor stepped into the marble-floored rotunda, the ambient hum of classical string quartets and silver champagne flutes resonated throughout the hall. She adjusted her tailored emerald gown, the one Julian had gifted her for their silver anniversary, and walked toward the main VIP registration desk. "Good evening, Eleanor Vance," she said with a warm, courteous smile to the young attendant wearing an event coordinator's badge. The attendant's fingers danced across her laptop keyboard. A subtle frown creased her forehead. She refreshed the portal, cleared her search, and tried again. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am. I don't seem to have a reservation under that name." Eleanor chuckled softly, assuming a simple typo had occurred. "That's perfectly fine. I'm Julian Vance's wife. It might be listed under Vance Heritage Holdings or our personal residential address." "Please wait just one moment," the coordinator murmured before stepping quietly into an adjacent hallway. A moment later, she returned accompanied by a tall, stern event manager wearing a radio piece. His expression was polite but distant. "Mrs. Vance, I'm afraid your name does not appear on tonight's approved guest list." Eleanor felt a slight prickle of confusion, though she maintained her composed posture. "There must be an administrative oversight. My husband left early this afternoon for the board photography session. Could you please notify him that I've arrived?" The event manager tapped his earpiece, spoke quietly into his microphone, and listened for several agonizing seconds. When he looked up, his posture had hardened. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance. Mr. Vance personally reviewed and finalized tonight's restricted entry list 30 minutes ago." Eleanor stood motionless as the sounds of laughter and clinking crystal seemed to mute around her. She looked past the security personnel into the grand ballroom. Through the towering glass doors, she saw Julian standing near the main dais in a bespoke tuxedo, holding a glass of vintage champagne. Beside him stood Chloe Mercer, the young, ambitious vice president of global brand strategy, wearing an elegant sapphire dress. As Eleanor watched, Julian's eyes drifted toward the entrance and locked onto hers. Recognition flashed across his face for a fraction of a second. Then, without a hint of hesitation or surprise, Julian turned his shoulder deliberately away, returning to his conversation as though she were a complete stranger standing in the rain. Two security guards approached respectfully. "Ma'am, we've been asked to escort you to the exit." Eleanor drew a slow, steady breath. She did not raise her voice or make a scene. "Thank you. That won't be necessary. I can find my own way out." She walked back through the rotunda with her head held high. Once inside her vehicle, she sat silently in the dark cabin as rain drummed against the glass. She took out her smartphone and typed a single message to Arthur Pendleton, the longtime custodian of her family's private trust. "Arthur, execute the immediate freeze on all intellectual property licenses and halt the Vance Heritage Sovereign Trust right now." Within 7 seconds, Arthur replied, "Eleanor, are you entirely certain?" She stared at the illuminated Guildhall doors one last time and typed back, "Yes. Do it now." Before Eleanor had even cleared the streetlights of Piccadilly, her phone began to vibrate violently in the center console. First came 3 missed calls from Julian, followed by a flurry of urgent messages from the firm's chief legal officer and two prominent members of the board. Eleanor switched her phone to silent, letting the blue light pulse harmlessly against the dashboard. As she drove through the quiet, tree-lined avenues of Kensington toward her family home, decades of memories flooded her mind. When Vanguard Green Tech was founded 25 years ago, there were no Mayfair galas or multi-million-pound corporate valuations. There was only an abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of Leith, a mountain of unpaid bills and structural engineering diagrams that Eleanor drew late into the night. When the company faced liquidation during the energy crisis of 2004, Eleanor made the silent, monumental sacrifice that saved everything. She liquidated her entire ancestral inheritance, selling her late father's estate in Aberdeenshire to infuse capital into Vanguard. Julian had wept openly at their kitchen table that night, pressing her hands to his face and swearing he would spend the rest of his life ensuring the world recognized her sacrifice. In later years, as Julian's public profile grew and his appetite for high society galas expanded, Eleanor gradually stepped back from the public eye. She took over the care of Julian's aging mother during her long battle with dementia and stepped in to manage the household and family affairs when their daughter, Clara, entered medical school. Eleanor had never truly disappeared. She had simply anchored the foundation so Julian could shine in the spotlight. But somewhere along the line, Julian had begun to mistake her quiet strength for irrelevance. When Eleanor pulled into the cobblestone driveway of her residence, she noticed her daughter Clara's car parked outside. Clara, now a senior surgical resident, was standing on the front porch wrapped in her winter coat, holding a glossy Gala program booklet in her hands. "Mom," Clara said softly as Eleanor stepped out into the crisp night air. Clara's eyes were brimming with restraint and concern. They walked inside to the quiet sanctuary of the library. Clara laid the official event program flat upon the mahogany desk. Eleanor opened it to the executive overview page. Beneath the grand portrait of Julian were the gilded words, Julian Vance, visionary founder, sole architect, and builder of Vanguard Green Tech. There was not a single mention of Eleanor anywhere in the booklet, no acknowledgement of her founding patents, her early equity, or her 25 years of partnership. "I left the Guildhall the second I realized what he'd done," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with indignation. "He told the press and the board that you preferred to stay home because corporate events overwhelmed you. And Mom, there's something worse." Eleanor met her daughter's gaze calmly. "Tell me, Clara." "I overheard him speaking to Chloe Mercer behind the main stage," Clara said, tears finally escaping down her cheeks. "He told her that after tonight's announcement, he wouldn't have to hide their relationship anymore. He said you were a relic of his past." Eleanor sat in the silence of the room. The pain was deep, but beneath it lay a crystalline clarity. The 30-year foundation of her marriage had not shattered tonight. It had been dismantled piece by piece while she was busy holding the rest of their lives together. At 6 a.m. the following morning, the silence of the library was shattered by a phone call. Eleanor answered calmly. "Eleanor, what on earth have you done?" Julian's voice erupted through the speaker, tight with fury and exhaustion. "The board is in absolute chaos. The underwriters for the global expansion have halted the transaction because the patent pool is locked. Do you have any idea how much embarrassment you've caused me in front of international investors?" Eleanor leaned back against her chair, her tone impossibly steady. "You barred me from the company we built together, Julian. You had security escort me out like an intruder. That was a tactical corporate decision." Julian snapped, dismissing her words instantly. "Vanessa, I mean Chloe, thought your presence would create awkward social dynamics given our upcoming administrative changes. You haven't been active in the operational side of Vanguard for a decade. You're holding up a billion-pound expansion over wounded vanity. I stepped away from daily operations to care for your dying mother and raise our daughter while you traveled the world," Eleanor replied softly. "You thanked me then for those sacrifices." Now you act as though my contributions never existed. This is business, Eleanor. You can't use an obsolete trust to sabotage my legacy. Julian yelled before slamming the phone down. 10 minutes later, Arthur Pendleton arrived at the house carrying a leather briefcase. His face was grave as he sat across from Eleanor, spreading several corporate documents over the table. Eleanor, after you texted me last night, I conducted a full audit of the filings submitted to the Intellectual Property Office and the Corporate Registry over the past quarter, Arthur said, adjusting his spectacles. 3 months ago, an legal amendment was filed requesting the full, temporary transfer of the Vance Sovereign Trust's voting authority directly to Julian. Eleanor's brow furrowed. I never signed any transfer paperwork. I know you didn't, Arthur said quietly, sliding an electronic signature verification report toward her. Our forensic document analysts reviewed the digital certificate stamped on the document. The signature was lifted from an old 2012 corporate resolution and digitally forged onto the authorization form. A cold wind swept against the tall window panes. Eleanor realized in that instant that Julian's actions were not merely those of an unfaithful husband seeking a quiet divorce. He and his inner circle had executed a calculated, fraudulent attempt to strip her of her legal heritage, her intellectual property, and her vote before the public listing went live. Who submitted the electronic file? Eleanor asked smoothly. It originated from an IP address assigned directly to Chloe Mercer's communications team at corporate headquarters, Arthur revealed. It is no longer just a personal betrayal, Eleanor. It is corporate fraud. Eleanor looked down at her hands that had once drawn the blueprints that powered thousands of homes. Then call Harold Sterling, the board chairman. Tell him I am invoking my right as primary trustee to call an emergency board session at 9 o'clock. The emergency board meeting took place on the 40th floor of Vanguard's headquarters in Canary Wharf. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the Thames cut through the misty London horizon, but inside the boardroom, the tension was suffocating. Harold Sterling, the 70-year-old chairman whose family had backed Vanguard's mid-stage expansion, called the meeting to order. Julian sat at the far end of the long conference table in a sharp suit, though dark circles under his eyes betrayed his lack of sleep. Chloe Mercer sat 2 seats down from him, clutching a leather notepad, avoiding all eye contact with Eleanor. We are convened under extraordinary circumstances, Harold began, his voice dry and authoritative. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, co-trustee of the Vance Sovereign Trust, has exercised her contractual right to suspend the intellectual property licensing agreements vital to our global expansion package. Julian leaned forward, attempting to project his trademark confidence. Harold, this is purely a domestic dispute that has unfortunately bled into corporate affairs. Eleanor is understandably emotional about our pending separation, but we cannot allow personal grievances to delay a transaction of this magnitude. This is not a domestic dispute, Julian, Harold interrupted coldly. When security removed the primary holder of our core title kinetic patents from our own launch event, it became an enterprise risk. Furthermore, our chief financial officer has raised additional matters that require immediate clarification. The CFO, Margaret Thorne, passed a series of financial audit printouts around the table. During our final review of executive expenditure ahead of the listing, we flagged several significant anomalies over the past 18 months. She highlighted line items in yellow: a luxury estate lease in Côte d'Azur, multi-million-pound transfers to an unverified PR agency registered in the Cayman Islands under Chloe Mercer's brother, and private aviation charges billed under R&D. Julian's face flushed red. Those were necessary expenditures for international client acquisition and brand positioning. None of these expenditures were submitted to or approved by the board, Margaret stated firmly. Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice calm, clear, and commanding. I am not asking for explanations today, Harold. I am demanding a complete, independent forensic audit of all executive expenses and patent filings. If these transactions are legitimate, the audit will prove it. Julian glared across the table at his wife. You have no authority to stall this company. She has every authority, Harold declared, standing up. The trust she controls owns 40% of our core technology patents. Until this forensic audit is concluded and the legitimacy of recent filings verified, Julian Vance is hereby suspended from his role as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Julian froze, staring at the board members in sheer disbelief as every hand around the table, including Harold's, rose in unanimous agreement. For the first time in 25 years, Julian Vance looked genuinely terrified. By the following afternoon, news of Julian's suspension had sent shockwaves through the financial press. Vanguard's share offering was put on temporary hold, and rumors of corporate malfeasance began to circulate. Yet, Eleanor refused to leak details to the press, focusing entirely on unearthing the complete truth. Late that evening, Eleanor received a delicate request for a private meeting from an unexpected person, Chloe Mercer. They met at a quiet, secluded tea room near Hyde Park. When Chloe walked in, she looked nothing like the polished, untouchable executive who had stood beside Julian at the Guildhall. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands trembled as she sat down across from Eleanor. "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Vance," Chloe whispered, clutching her handbag tightly. "I am listening, Chloe," Eleanor said gently, showing neither malice nor anger. "I need you to know. I didn't forge your signature," Chloe stammered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Julian told me that your marriage had been legally dissolved years ago in private. He told me you were living comfortably off an estate settlement and that you wanted nothing to do with Vanguard anymore. He said you hated the corporate world and that bringing you to events would only cause you distress." Eleanor took a quiet sip of her tea. "And the trust documents?" "Julian asked me to retrieve archival signature pages from the 2012 original founder agreements," Chloe confessed, her voice barely audible. "He told me it was just an administrative update for the IP office. I didn't realize what he was doing until the auditors pulled the digital records yesterday. I was foolish, Mrs. Vance. I believed everything he said because he made me feel like I was part of something grand. Julian has extraordinary talent for making people feel indispensable right up until he no longer needs them," Eleanor said softly. Chloe looked down in shame. "I resigned from Vanguard this morning. I've turned over all internal communications and files to your legal team. I know it doesn't excuse what I did, but I couldn't keep lying for him." After Chloe left, Arthur Pendleton entered the tea room and sat in her place. He placed a new file on the table. "The international consortium leading the acquisition just called," Arthur reported with a faint smile. "They've reviewed the core patent registries and realized that every fundamental technological breakthrough Vanguard owns bears your name as the sole primary inventor." "And what did they say?" Eleanor asked. "They said they have no interest in dealing with Julian Vance anymore," Arthur replied. "They want to negotiate the future of the company directly with you, because they believe you are the only person left at Vanguard with actual integrity." The next morning, Eleanor drove down to Bristol to visit Vanguard's primary engineering and manufacturing center, the beating heart of the company where the tidal turbines were built. As she walked onto the vast factory floor, the deafening hum of heavy machinery softened. Older engineers and technicians stopped their work, recognizing her immediately. An old colleague with graying hair and oil-stained overalls stepped forward, George Ramsey, a master machinist who had helped Eleanor construct her very first turbine module 23 years ago. "Mrs. Vance," George said, his rough hand warmly grasping hers. "We've been reading the news. Everyone on the floor is terrified. Are they going to close us down?" Eleanor looked around at the faces of the men and women gathered in the workshop, people who had given decades of their lives to turn her equations into real-world energy. "The company is not closing, George. I promise you that." Later, in the supervisor's office, George handed Eleanor a confidential document that had been leaked from the corporate strategy office weeks earlier. It was a planned post-listing restructuring blueprint drafted under Julian's directives. The document revealed that immediately following the public listing, Julian planned to eliminate over 300 manufacturing jobs in Bristol, outsourcing production overseas and cutting veteran pension liabilities to inflate short-term profit margins. Eleanor felt a sharp burn in her chest. Julian had ceased seeing the company as a community of human beings. To him, it had become nothing more than a personal ledger to fund his ambition. That afternoon, Eleanor met directly with the lead representative of the Green Infrastructure Consortium, Lady Beatrice Montgomery. "We are prepared to acquire the operating assets of Vanguard at full valuation," Mrs. Vance, Lady Beatrice, declared across the table at the Bristol Conference Centre. "But we need your backing to ensure continuity." Eleanor laid her legal pad flat on the desk. "I will support the transaction on 4 non-negotiable conditions." Lady Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "First, an absolute 3-year guarantee against any workforce reductions at the Bristol facility," Eleanor stated firmly. "Second, complete, ironclad protection for all existing employee pension funds. Third, the immediate reinstatement of the worker training initiatives Julian cancelled last year. And fourth, Julian Vance must be permanently barred from holding any executive or advisory role in this enterprise." Lady Beatrice studied Eleanor for several seconds, then a slow, respectful smile touched her lips. "Those are not standard corporate demands, Mrs. Vance. They are moral ones. And we accept every single one of them." That evening, Julian's legal team filed an emergency court injunction to strip Eleanor of her trust powers, but the High Court judge dismissed the petition within an hour, citing indisputable evidence of document tampering and declaring Eleanor's authority as primary trustee absolute. On Monday morning, the final forensic audit report was delivered to the board of directors. The findings were devastating. Julian had not only authorized fraudulent trust filings and misallocated executive funds, but in a final act of desperation just days before his suspension, he had attempted to transfer £5 million from the corporate reserve accounts into a private offshore entity. The board voted unanimously to terminate Julian Vance for gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty, stripping him of all executive stock options. Later that afternoon, Julian called Eleanor, begging for one final private meeting. She agreed, meeting him on a quiet bench in St. James's Park, far away from corporate boardrooms and media cameras. When Julian approached, Eleanor barely recognized him. The sharp, immaculate image he had cultivated for decades had crumbled. His designer coat was unbuttoned, his tie was loosened, and his eyes were hollowed by defeat. He sat heavily at the far end of the wooden bench. "They've taken everything, Eleanor," Julian whispered, staring blankly at the ducks swimming in the park pond. "The board, the press, the expansion. My name is ruined." "You took it from yourself, Julian," Eleanor replied quietly. "You spent years rewriting our history until you actually believed you created everything alone." Julian covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. "When the company began to win international awards, people started looking at me like I was a genius. I loved it, Eleanor. I loved the applause so much that I couldn't bear sharing it with anyone, not even you. Chloe admired me. She looked at me the way people look at a titan. With you, you knew who I really was. You remembered the desperate man in the Leith garage who couldn't pay rent." "I loved that man in the Leith garage," Eleanor said softly, her voice filled with gentle sadness rather than malice. "He was honest, hard-working, and humble. But you traded him away for applause." Julian slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn velvet box, the same box Eleanor had left in her car on the night of the gala. He had retrieved it from the valet service. "I found this," Julian choked out, opening the box to reveal the restored brass compass with its engraved date. "I remembered the night we built that first module. You gave up your father's estate for me, Eleanor, and I tried to erase you from the story. You didn't erase me, Julian, Eleanor said, standing up gracefully. You only erased yourself from my future. She turned and walked down the gravel path, leaving Julian sitting alone under the autumn trees with the brass compass resting in his trembling hands. 1 year later, the Grand Hall of the Royal Society of Arts in London was filled to capacity for the annual Global Clean Energy Leadership Summit. Harold Stirling stepped up to the podium, looking out over the crowd of engineers, scientists, and industry leaders. Tonight, as we celebrate the landmark integration of the Atlantic Tidal Energy Grid, a project that has secured clean power for millions of homes while protecting thousands of manufacturing jobs, we must correct a long-standing historical oversight, Harold announced, his voice echoing through the hall. He gestured toward the front row. For too long, the story of this technology was attributed to a single voice. But true innovation is built on integrity, sacrifice, and quiet, brilliant leadership. Please join me in honoring the true co-founder, chief architect, and executive chairwoman of Vanguard Energy, Mrs. Eleanor Vance. The entire auditorium rose to its feet in a thunderous, prolonged standing ovation. Eleanor walked up the steps to the stage wearing a simple, elegant ivory suit. As she accepted the Crystal Lifetime Achievement Award, she looked into the audience and saw her daughter, Clara, smiling proudly with tears in her eyes. In her acceptance speech, Eleanor did not speak of betrayal, lawsuits, or corporate battles. Instead, she spoke of the machinists in Bristol, the young female engineers entering the field, and the fundamental duty of leaders to protect the people who build their dreams. With her settled share of the corporate restructuring, Eleanor established the Vance Heritage Innovation Foundation, an endowment providing full university scholarships and research grants for women pursuing structural engineering and environmental science. Months later, the divorce was finalized quietly without media fanfare. Julian moved to a quiet village in northern France, living off a modest personal pension, completely isolated from the corporate world he had once sought to conquer. Chloe Mercer found work with an environmental nonprofit, slowly rebuilding her career with honest labor. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Eleanor walked along the coast near Edinburgh with her young grandson, holding his tiny hand as the crisp sea breeze swept across the Firth of Forth. In the distance, giant tidal turbines hummed silently beneath the blue waves, converting the unstoppable power of the ocean into light. Her grandson looked up at her, his eyes wide with wonder. "Grandma, did you really help build all of those?" Eleanor smiled warmly, looking out at the endless horizon where the sun reflected off the clear water. "Yes, my darling," she answered softly. "I built them to last." The story of Eleanor Vance serves as a profound reminder that true strength lies not in seeking public applause, but in remaining rooted in dignity and integrity. The greatest lesson we can draw from her journey is that you can never truly be erased from a story you helped write, no matter how hard others try to rewrite history for their own vanity. When we choose to act out of quiet principle rather than petty revenge, we unlock a quiet power that outlasts any temporary betrayal. Real success is never measured by how high we rise alone, but by how well we protect and uplift the people who helped us build our dreams along the way. If you ever find yourself in a season where your quiet contributions are overlooked, your sacrifices taken for granted, or your place at the table dismissed, remember to stay patient and hold on to your integrity. Lies may win the short race and gather temporary applause, but truth has remarkable endurance, and in the end, a life built on honesty and quiet resilience will always stand tall long after the noise fades away.